sometime when you get a chance, you should drive out to Summerlin.
So is that kind of like, it kind of looks like you're going up into the...
Oh yeah, we're 1,000 feet higher.
Oh really?
Up against the mountain. It's 10 degrees cooler up there. Also in the winter, but it's cold in the winter here.
All right. So right at me and say the sentence, when I arrived at Nordhausen.
Okay. When I arrived at Nordhausen, we first saw a barbed wire enclosure around a number of buildings. And we entered through the cut wire through the gate of this enclosure, and I was stunned, horrified is the word, of what I saw in that compound. There were some barracks, some buildings, but in the compound itself, there were scattered bodies all over the compound, and in one corner, they were stacked up like firewood. Bodies had been thrown into a corner, one stacked upon the other, without regard to how they fell. When we first entered the barracks, these people were lying on flat platforms, about 2 by 2 feet, stacked about 4 high, and you could not tell which ones were alive and which ones were dead. There was a odor permeating the whole area, entirely different from the type of odor you detect when you smell a dead animal out in the field. That's a sharp, sour odor. The dead soldiers we saw had a kind of they were all well fed, of course, and they had a kind of a sweet odor from rancid fat. But the prisoners and the dead people smelled like mildew. There was no evidence of they looked like they'd been mummified almost. There's no fat on them and very little muscle. And I got the feeling they were just stick figures lying there, almost inhuman in their composure. The people who were alive, some were standing when they could, and they were all in these striped uniforms, prison-type uniforms, were people who I don't see how, they were emaciated. They had a look on their face. Of course, they could probably not speak English and could not understand us, but they were just, they horrified me. In fact, until I recently was reminded about this experience by Cato, I had pretty well abolished the idea, the thought of it from my mind. Even my family and my children and my associates have never heard this story because I had forgotten it deliberately. It so horrified me that the idea of it was so intangible, so difficult to comprehend that a civilized people would so take such terrible care of their prisoners, of anyone. It's incomprehensible that such a thing should happen.
Right. That was it. We got really good the Nordhausen camp, and then how it relates to Dora, which is where they were making the we'll talk about that. Okay. So
Nordhausen is located on just the southern banks of the Hertz Mountains, and it's a small German town of a few thousand people. Just north of Nordhausen is where the Dora camp was located. Now, the Dora camp was a concentration camp reserved for the people that were placed there by the Nazis. These were prisoners. They were Some of them, the Nazis called them, a lot of them, Untermenschen, which were people from the eastern part of Europe, the Slavs, who were not Aryan, and who the Nazis felt were not complete humans. A few Jews were also present, but surprisingly, most of the Jews were at the larger camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. This place was not a place to kill people. It was a place to keep cheap help. And they were cheap because they didn't feed them. They fed them on 1,200 calories or less per day diet. You can't live on that. And the people that could work, they put to work on these tunnels. It's what they called the metal work. And these tunnels, of course, were the V-2 rocket places. But the people were cheap help. They didn't have to feed them much. They certainly didn't pay them. And they worked them to death. They worked them until they couldn't work anymore, and they were put on their shelf in the barracks. And when they died, they were hauled out and thrown on the pile. Now, in the literature I've seen about Nordhausen since then, you see this large open area with row after row after row of bodies that you see all laid out, ready for burial. And of course, that took place several days after I was there, because when I was there, it was one unorganized Holocaust, literally. The people of the guards at the camp were there when the first members of the 104th Division showed up. A few shots were exchanged, and then these guards just melted away. Now, of course, they lived in Nordhausen, and they went to work every day supervising these poor people. The scientists at the middle work lived in special places and were protected from any air attacks or anything like that. The guards themselves lived in Nordhausen. They'd put on their hat and coat and go to work every day at this prison camp where they supervised the slow death of these people. And then at night they went back to Nordhausen. Now when the army got there, these guards just disappeared. Their uniforms disappeared, and they melted right into the populace. And and interestingly, the people of Nordhausen denied ever knowing that this type camp existed. They themselves had their own workplace, but the people working at the camp also lived there. They were members of Nordhausen, but the people of Nordhausen, they'd never heard of this place.
Good. About having to, were you involved in going and getting them?
No.
Okay.
We were long gone by
Oh,
then.
okay. So you were just, let's stop it there. I want to get this back.
Well, as background, interestingly, I was in Nordhausen, Germany, as a captain in the Medical Administrative Corps. That's the Medical Service Corps now. But 4 years previously, I was a buck private in the U.S. Army, knowing nothing about the Army service. And then I was sent to a camp, a hospital, Letterman General Hospital in San Francisco, to learn to be a surgical technician. And the minute I got back to Fort Lewis to be a surgical technician, they found out I could type. And so they put me in the office, and that was that as far as that training was concerned. The nice thing is that when I was in the office, I could find out whatever was going on in the Army. And there was a posting on the bulletin board for officer candidate school. So I applied, and I was accepted. And then I was sent to Carlisle Barracks, the old Carlisle Indian School, where Jim Thorpe played his game. And I was there for 3 months. We called ourselves 90-day wonders, because by the grace of God and an act of Congress, we were then second lieutenant until we were officers and gentlemen. I was sent to the camp down in Tullahoma, Tennessee, as a second lieutenant into a medical group or medical regiment. from there, we were sent overseas. Interestingly enough, we were sent over on the Queen Mary. Now, the Titanic had they had 1,500 people aboard it, and room for 1,200 perhaps, something like that. On the Queen Mary, we had room for probably 2,000 of lifeboats. We had 15,000 troops on board the Queen Mary. Queen Mary crossed the Atlantic in the dead of winter without anybody to accompany it. It was too fast. And so they zigzagged, took 5 days, across the North Atlantic until we landed in Glasgow, Scotland. And then we went down to an area near London called Reading and trained there. And just before we went to Normandy, my unit went out to Falmouth, right way out on the west side. We got on board the ship the day before the landings in Normandy. We had to get all dressed up, and we were told exactly how to sit and stand, and then a group of officers started quizzing us as to what we knew. Now, I'm an old stamp collector, and I know everything about geography. I was totally skilled in geography. And so they started asking about where this was and that was, and I knew those answers. And what's this little island off the coast of Australia, southeast coast? Well, that's Tasmania. Okay, what's the capital of Tasmania? It's Hobart. I knew all this. I guess they thought I knew enough to go. A further interest is that you have to have a certain 20/40 vision in order without glasses. Now my vision is 2200. I couldn't possibly pass the physical examination to get to be an officer candidate. But it was a dark room. Took my glasses off. Before I took my glasses off, memorized the chart a bit. Took my glasses off, and then they started asking me about the numbers of the letters. And if you push back, if you're nearsighted, if you shorten the distance between your lens and your retina, you just push the focal point right back to the retina. So I got there and pushed my eye out, and I could read all of them, but that's the way I passed. Weird.
You know, that works.
Yes, it does. Just the GI, and we scrubbed, cleaned floors, changed bandages, accompanied the real doctors around on their rounds. We were just a little bit lower than the nurses. And so I learned how to scrub floors. When I worked at Rexburg was a doctor, I sometimes get in and wipe up the floor for them, and they were astonished because doctors don't do that. Where were we now?
Let's talk a little bit about how they went into the town of Nordhausen and brought the citizens of the town over here.
Okay. Now we went through. Incidentally, Eisenhower himself visited Nordhausen almost the time that I was there. He was way up front, and he hadn't been to the real Auschwitz and all those terrible camps. Nordhausen didn't have the furnaces and the disposal systems of the other camps. It was a little camp, and that's why the bodies were stacked so high there, because they didn't have time to transport them all for incineration. But when Eisenhower was there, he just had a fit. He has a short temper anyway, and so he knew these people had to be buried, so he rounded up all the people down at Nordhausen, the town, and brought them up there to see what was going on. And then they made them dig the graves and bury them. Now this area of Nordhausen, just south and a little east of Nordhausen, is Weimar. That's the old Weimar Republic headquarters. And Jena, that's where they make Leica cameras. This is just a little bit west of can't remember it. Anyway, so all these people then had to go in there and see what had happened. And only then, and of course none of them had any idea that this was going on. When all the Jews were rounded up during the time that they moved the Jews out to the camps, these people were pleased because they got their property, they got their houses, they got all their jewelry and the money and everything. So they were kind of pleased that the Jews were kicked out. But of course they didn't know anything about what they did to the Jews. The Jews were all sent to a camp in the east in which they would be replaced and put out to pasture some way. Certainly Hitler had what he called the final solution. And at first this was unknown by the general German people or even the army. But he had a meeting of all the members of the High Army Command, and he outlined the final solution, which was to eradicate all Jews and then to extend east into the eastern part of Europe, where the breadbasket of Europe is, take over the land and eradicate all the untermenschen. Stop.
Let's say that, because I was kind of interested in the fact that you can't get much more German than Eisenhower.
Yes, all right.
Let's say a little bit about that. We rolling?
Okay. When we were at Nordhausen, at the Dora camp, Nordhausen is just the name of the town, everybody called it that. When Eisenhower got there, this was really the first camp like this that he'd seen. The only one further west than that was Bergen-Belsen, but that was up in the bridge zone. And Auschwitz and all those other camps in the further east were too far east. We hadn't gotten those yet. So Nordhausen was really the first camp that he got into. As I said before, Eisenhower had a short temper. He was a very angry man sometimes. He got into that place and he was furious. And he was ashamed that he had a German name, because and right then he made it a rule. Every time they came across a camp like that, the nearby German towns had to furnish the workers to come clean up the place and bury the bodies. These bodies were, of course, stripped of all clothing. When they died, if they had gold teeth, they were all removed. Every bit of clothing was removed and rehabilitated for German citizens and for the army. And what was left was a bag of bones. Nothing left at all. You could see all these, quote, naked people lying there, and it was nothing. They were not, didn't feel like real people anymore. In fact, after you see them for a while, you get kind of accustomed to it so that it doesn't grate on you. Only when you began to think about it, then it really got to you. If you've seen this movie, Saving Private Ryan, you see all the mayhem that takes place. This movie was filmed in Ireland, but it is so much exactly like it was when I was there on Omaha Beach in Normandy. And by the time I got there were lots of bodies around, but the day after that, they were cleaned up. And the reason is that's a bad morale issue to see a bunch of dead soldiers. All of us there, and all the men in the infantry especially, all felt that they were never going to die. Yeah, that was so far. We're all young guys in their early 20s, and it wouldn't have occurred to, certainly didn't occur to me that I would ever die like that, and it did not occur to these people. And one of the reasons is that right after the first wave of infantry got into there, the bodies were cleaned up by the grave registration people, because it was bad morale to see these. At first, right the very first, they were not accustomed to working that way. And I saw trucks go down the highway uncovered with a bunch of bodies in the back, and that's kind of bad. They were not allowed to lie around like the cattle, horses that were killed. They just lay around in this summer heat and bloated up, and the bodies would do the same if you left them long. And so we quickly took care of that. It took a long time once we got into Omaha Beach up in Normandy. Up on top of the cliffs there, we just stayed for a month. Two reasons. One, we need to get supplies ashore, and the second reason is that a big storm came up and stopped all supplies. It wrecked the temporary mooring place that we had for ships. If Hitler had not been in control of the thing, we'd have probably been pushed right back into the ocean. But they didn't dare wake him up. He was asleep, and he was a slow riser. And so until noon, he was asleep. They didn't dare touch him. And they didn't dare move any tanks or anything in until he was awakened. And then he wasn't sure, because he was sure that we were going to invade at the Pas-de-Calais. That was the place he was sure of, and he thought this was just a phase to take away that interest. We were there for a long time. I remember I lived in a foxhole for a month. We ate, lived, slept in foxhole. We were up and around all day long, but at night when the barrages came in and when there was any danger, I would jump down the foxhole. We were so long in the foxhole that I elongated mine. I had an army cot down in there, very comfortable. But the poor GI didn't have that. Then we literally, after the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, where the big bombing came, they were, I don't know, thousands of planes came over and bombed the strip of land there, eradicate everything. And then Patton got through and away went. And then we raced across France. I went into Paris. I went into a little area in Paris. Benjamin Franklin stayed in a little town just west of Paris called Passey. And I knew that, so I went into Paris looking for that town. Incidentally, I got into Paris the day before General de Gaulle liberated. He got the credit, but we were there first. Anyway, so I went there, but there was no Passey anymore. But there's a Rue de la Passey, and I bought the perfume on that street in Paris. And then we went on past Reims and across the Belgian border, and on till we got to near past Liège in Belgium, and up to a little town called what? I can't remember. Doesn't matter. Just north of Normandy. Now Normandy's where they had that big massacre in the Battle of the Bulge. Now just before, Eupen is the town. Just before that happened, the Battle of the Bulge, my brother was in the 106th Division. And it was a brand new division, which was up in the Hurtgen Forest, right on the Siegfried line, up among the pillboxes and the tank traps. And a day or two before the Battle of the Bulge, I had my Jeep, my driver, and we went up and saw my brother was the first sergeant in this infantry regiment. And he said he was never so surprised in his life to see me there. But when I got out of there, a day or two after, they were overcome by the Battle of the Bulge. They were new infantry, and within 30 minutes they were captured. My brother was captured, and finally at the end of the war, he got out all right. My poor mother must have had frights, because she would get a telegram saying my brother was missing in action. And of course the mail wasn't doing it, so for 2 or 3 weeks she didn't get any mail from me either. So she must have been horrified. Then, of course, they crossed the bridge at Remagen, and the bridge eventually fell in, but I crossed on a pontoon bridge, went to Kappel, and then over to Nordhausen, just on the sweep of the First Army to the east. And it was at that time that I first even heard about concentration camps. Perhaps the people in the United States heard something about them. Well, they couldn't have, because we were first there. But the rumors had seeped back to the people in Washington. They knew vaguely of what happened about concentration camps, but they just had no idea of the concept, the huge amount, the 6 million Jews, for instance, that were killed in these camps. And it was then that I got to Nordhausen and saw for myself what happened. Now, interestingly enough, the as I said before, I'd forgotten. I'd erased it from my mind. And I'd gone to medical school and then gone on to Rexburg. I retired when I was 65 from Rexburg. I moved to Salt Lake and worked for an HMO there for 10 more years. I finally retired when I was 75, about 6 years ago. And at this HMO, I met Cato, and I was teasing her because she was speaking in a Germanic tongue, and I called her German, and she hit the ceiling because she was not German and she wasn't about to let me think she was. And of course she said then she was Dutch. She said, I was even in one of those concentration camps. And I said, oh yeah, which one? Nordhausen. I thought, oh my word, I might have even seen her there. She was a 12-year-old girl when she was put in that camp. And how she survived. I said in my preface to her book that only somebody as stubborn as Cato could have really survived that long in that camp. Because she went through an awful lot. You can tell. You read her book? Yes. Anyway, interestingly, then I was willing to let it go. But Cato is she said, stubborn. And she kept after me and after me about it. First thing you know, she had newspaper interviews. In fact, we were in the Desert News and a big spread, and it had some pictures of the camp and all. And then ever since I moved down here, she's been after me a little bit about her book. And then even 2 years ago, I was asked to appear at a nurses conference up at Hebert. And there I talked about, Cato gave her talk first, and then I talked about my experiences.
We're about out of time. You felt when you saw all of this, and then,
yeah.
I mean, here it is, almost 60 years. Let's not mention any specific date, but
55 years later.
Let's just say over 50 years later.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Of interest, when we approached these German towns, they all had white flags sticking out of their upper windows to surrender. There was no fight left in them. We were just rolling as fast as we could, trying to beat the Russians, of course. Oh, further interest that I might mention is that the scientists at Nordhausen were the most important people there. And when they came into Nordhausen to relieve it, the people they removed first were von Braun and his group, even before the prisoners, and flew them to New Mexico, where they started our program, our rocket program. Now we went into these towns, they were all alike. Most of them not demolished. The bigger towns, Aachen, Cologne, were bombed out, shells. But when we got to Nordhausen, it was just a village, a few windows knocked out, but that's all. And so we rolled up to this concentration camp. There's barbed wire, nothing there. But when we entered it, I was literally thunderstruck at exactly what I was trying to see. You couldn't believe it. You could not believe, without being there, as to the terribleness of the situation. The stacked bodies, this mildew, rotten stench that you could feel in the area. These bodies strung out all over the parade ground or the area. I wiped it out of my mind. I could not. And literally, after I left that area, I'd forgotten much except for a little I'd read about this. And I had let it escape me. And I think I said earlier that I've never talked about it until the time that Cato nudged me a bit when I was in Salt Lake City. My family, my friends, everybody I know, I have not talked to about this at all. This is, at that time, less than 10 years ago, did I open up and remember. And now I remember it vividly, and how horrified I actually was. I can't describe how I feel about it. I see these articles from the people in Germany, the skinheads, who say, "Oh, such a thing didn't ever exist." That's not true. And it is important that my story get out a little bit. Certainly the Cato story. My generation and World War II veterans are dying. There's not many of us left. They figure that 1,000 of us a day are dying of World War II vets. Now I was just a kid when I went in. I had the hay stalks still behind my ears, and most of the soldiers were older than I, and so most of those people are dead. We had a reunion of my group in Indianapolis a few years ago, and there were a few turned up. They were old people. I was surprised how old they were. And of course, I never did age. I'm the same as I've always been.